Batman had long been one of DC's biggest characters, but by the 80s had yet to make the leap to the big screen. That all changed in 1989 when a director known for quirky fare cast an actor known mainly for comedies and an Oscar winner as the villain, and then made a dark film about a comic book character that the public still associated with a colourful TV series from the 1960s.
What are you?
I'm Batman.
For a very long time, the only live-action superhero feature film that had ever impressed anyone was 1978's Superman the movie. Superman's DC stablemate Batman had featured in live-action serials in the 1940s, and later in an iconic TV comedy in the 1960s. But the Adam West series had made a great many people believe that Batman was a campy and colourful comedy character, rather than a dark and brooding vigilante that the comics had portrayed. More emo, less clown. Batman comics by the 80s were dark and brooding affairs, with Frank Miller's famous Dark Knight series from the mid-80s redefining the character in the minds of comic book readers. It's just that the mainstream audiences hadn't received the memo.
Oh gee, I never got the memo.
No one in Hollywood wanted to touch Batman with a 10-foot bat pole, except Michael Uslan, who had started the first college course on comic books in the 1970s. Now working in the film industry, he wanted to produce a Batman movie that kept faith with the shadowy character depicted in the comics. He met with Benjamin Melniker and they got the options on the character. Yada yada yada, a decade later, Batman came out. The end. No. But in the meantime, the project went through various studios before Warner Brothers realized, holy shit, we own DC. Uber producers John Peters and Peter Guber became the producers on Batman, bumping Uslan and Melniker to executive producer, credits they share to this day on even more recent Batman features. They may not actually have anything to do in a major way with any of the more recent films, but they are the main reason why we have any Batman films at all. Director Tim Burton came on board in 1986, but the studio was waiting to see how his quirky 1987 film Beetlejuice was going to do before committing itself 100% to both Burton and Batman, or is that Burtman and Batten?
Now that's good work.
Beetlejuice was a hit. So far, so good. Then Burton cast Michael Keaton as Batman. Well, even in the days before the internet, there was huffing and puffing from Batman fans, and not just the way they usually huffed and puffed after walking up a flight of stairs. Keaton was a comedian they huffed, not a serious actor they puffed, and a relatively short comedian at that. Despite all that, Keaton turned out a brilliant performance, so that was the end of that. And he was still miles ahead of at least two of his successors in the role. Gotham City, as is usually the way of things, is in the grip of a crime wave. A mysterious figure seems to be stepping in and taking out the crooks, and is, according to eyewitnesses, either a small man dressed as a bat, or a really large bat with opposable digits and a good grip on the flaws in the criminal justice system. Famed photojournalist Vicky Vale teams up with local newshound Knox to investigate the Batman. Meanwhile, the city's underworld boss, Carl Grissom, tries to deal with a troublesome underling, Jack Napier, who's not only out for Grissom's position, but also seeing his girlfriend.
You are my number one guy.
After being set up by Grissom, Napier ends up in a standoff with police in a chemical factory. I wonder how that's going to turn out. Which of the following is going to happen? A. Jack escapes by helicopter. B. Jack escapes by riding a magic carpet. C. Jack is rescued by pirates on segways. Or D. Jack falls into a vat of toxic chemicals. Batman intercedes and Jack falls into a vat of chemicals, scarring him, like a father-to-be watching The Omen for the first time.
Mirror!
Jack Napier is dead.
You can call me Joker. And as you can see, I'm a lot happier.
Batman's alter ego, millionaire playboy Bruce Wayne. The alter ego is always a millionaire or a billionaire. It's never a rubbish collector or a milkman. Millionaire playboy Bruce Wayne hooks up with Vicky Vale and wants to tell her his secret, but he's interrupted by Joker, who just wants to bring chaos to Gotham City for the reason that, holy shitballs, he's nuttier than a man with 6 testicles.
We'll just shake hands and that'll be it.
Yeah?
Yeah.
In this version of Batman, Joker was the man who killed Bruce Wayne's parents, and rather than thank Joker for turning him into a billionaire before he hit puberty, Bruce rather ungratefully tries to take the Joker down.
I made you. You made me first.
When I say I made you, you gotta say you made me. And how childish can you get?
Keaton proves to be that holy grail of Batmans, a barely contained psycho, a hero type so popular in the 1980s.
Lights out! Now you wanna get nuts? Come on! Let's get nuts.
His Bruce Wayne seems to be both loose with money
We need to open a few more cases of the champagne. Will that be all right?
Oh, sure. Go ahead. Oh, open, what, 6?
and at other times embarrassed by his wealth, like a trust fund kid hanging out in a crack house and apologising to the dealers for paying with crisp $100 bills and asking for change. As Batman, he's pretty dang good, with his enormous pointy ears and latex muscles. He's probably the first major superhero to dump the leotards and instead rubber up.
Nice outfit.
Kim Basinger as Vicky Vale was a last-minute replacement after Sean Young had been cast as Vale, but was injured in a horse riding accident just before shooting was to begin. Yeah, accident. Basinger does a pretty decent job with the role, being not too damselly, just damselly enough.
Why won't you let me in? I like bats.
She likes big bats that she cannot lie.
Michael Gough is a kindly Alfred, not quite the technological genius of later Alfreds, just a confidant and a butler who worries about Bruce like a parent.
I have no wish to fill my few remaining years grieving for the loss of old friends or their sons.
He also has a lucrative side hustle reselling champagne stolen from Bruce Wayne's cellar. Most of the other roles are filled with familiar faces in relatively small parts. Robert Wuhl, Pat Hingle, Jerry Hall, Billy D. Williams as a one-faced Harvey Dent, and Jack Palance. But the main draw here is Jack Nicholson's Joker.
You are a vicious bastard, retaliate. I'm glad you're dead.
Nicholson was a huge star, and not the first person you'd expect to appear in a role like this, or indeed in a film like this. He's fantastic in the role, more or less stealing every scene he's in and made it a cool thing for serious actors to be the villain in a comic book movie. I mean, the job was simple. You come in, get paid a ton of cash, and overact like a high school production of Death of a Salesman.
You ever dance with the devil in the pale moonlight? I always ask that of all my prey. I just like the sound of it.
Nicholson as Joker is not that much of a stretch if you actually think of some of his other roles like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or Witches of Eastwick. Though, looking back, he just seems like Jack Nicholson playing himself, imitating Cesar Romero. Which brings us to our next point. There was a spectre hanging around this Batman film, and no, it's not Sean Young's accident. It helped drag out the development process to more than 10 years before the film was finally released, and permeated nearly every aspect of production, in that this Batman must not remind you in any way of this Batman. So paranoid about comparisons to the Adam West series, or even being considered campy like that show, that everything was made darker and gritty and distinctly non-goofy.
Wait till they get a load of me.
You can see that in the cinematography, where the film looks not necessarily dark, but oddly dim and rather flat. The colour is toned right down and the film looks rather desaturated. It was to be as far from Batman 66 as you could get in the 80s. I mean, I get it. To use a hypothetical example, you don't want to go to your high school reunion and have everyone remember the time you peed yourself in geography class. Hypothetically, that person may have drunken a lot of water beforehand and the lesson was all about waterfalls and bursting dams. Hang on a second. Much better. Of course, looking at this now, all I can see is goofiness. It's aged well enough and is nowhere near as bad as its sequels, but to call this dark and gritty is a stretch. It sort of is, but only if you're comparing it to a TV show where Adam West wore a pink cowl. To a lesser extent, they also wanted to distance themselves from the Christopher Reeve Superman films that had started off well, but had gradually degenerated to the point where the metaphorical resemblance of Superman 4 to the insides of a ruptured septic tank could not be ignored. Batman has a score by Danny Elfman, who was still a relative newcomer to movie soundtracks, and even then mainly worked for Burton. But here, he introduces what has become one of the classic superhero themes. But the film also has songs by Prince, which have aged about as well as a prom queen with a meth habit. His hit song Bat Dance was basically a rambling collection of voice snippets from the film. It was meant to make the film cool and not goofy like this. This is the video clip, so who the hell knows? By all means, leave a comment about which Batman was goofier. Batman was one of the first films to have two different soundtrack albums. One album with Elfman's iconic score, and the one that everyone bought, Prince's album.
Oh, yeah.
which is filled with a bunch of songs that he wrote for the film, only some of which actually appear briefly in the film. I mean, Prince was a musical genius, but he was a prolific artist who recorded an awful lot of B-sides, many of which ended up on his Batman album. We have to make mention of the outstanding production design, which evokes a 30s aesthetic for buildings that also extends to the rather phallic Batmobile, a giant V12 dildo on wheels. Batman also has a slew of gadgets, from hooks and grapples and the Batwing, all of which made very cool toys, which is something that would become incredibly important to the franchise in future installments.
He's psychotic.
Some people say the same thing about you.
What people?
For a very long time, Batman had had his sidekick Robin, and while the character was featured in early drafts of the movie script, it was left out of later versions because there seemed zero interest from anyone involved in having Robin in the movie. He'd eventually make it into this series with the third film, but Robin had gone from being an essential part of Batman to an optional side quest in Oblivion DLC. Tim Burton's direction holds up well for the most part, but the action is a little stiff in places, like when you take triple the recommended dose of Viagra and try to go for a run without warming up first. This is the tail end of the pre-CG era, where everything had to be filmed live and optically composited. Even adding a stylized shadow to this scene required someone to animate it by hand. Overall, Batman was a good film to rehabilitate the character of Batman. We'd call it a reboot these days, but we were a few years from that becoming a thing. And Batman was a huge hit. You couldn't go anywhere in the second half of 1989 without seeing someone wearing a t-shirt with the Batman logo from the movie, or seeing riffs on Nicholson's Joker, or hearing one of Prince's god-awful songs. The summer of 1989 was considered a bloodbath at the cinemas due to a crowded marketplace of movies like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Lethal Weapon 2, Ghostbusters 2, Star Trek V: The Final Frontier, The Abyss, License to Kill, and Karate Kid 3, all vying for moviegoers' cash, and Batman sucked up so much attention that year. There were eventually 4 films made in this Batman universe, even though they ended up having 3 different actors playing Batman. The only common link is Michael Gough as Alfred, so these films could best be described as the Gotham City universe. I don't particularly enjoy the other films in this series to anywhere near the same extent as this film, which just has this sort of zing about it. It never feels breathless, nor does it drag. Batman was the single best superhero film of the 1980s, and would briefly herald a smallish wave of comic book adaptations influenced by this Tim Burton film. Few, if any, gained much traction, such as Warren Beatty's hyped version of Dick Tracy, or the short-lived 1990 TV version of The Flash. Batman was by far the biggest money spinner released in 1989, so it made perfect sense for Warner Brothers to throw money at Burton and Keaton to quickly make a follow-up. Meanwhile, Sean Young was lying in wait, ready to pounce. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, or check out some of our other videos.